The next thing I'd like to talk about, and this is probably one of my pet subjects, and that's lead paint. And lead paint has been on the agenda for a long, long time. In fact, when we were doing the research, putting these slides together, I was watching a film clip by George Negus when he was still young and handsome like I am today. So the issue is that it was probably about 15 years ago, and they were dealing with, they were naming builders and they were naming painters right back then, and they had a family with their little kid off in hospital with levels 200%, the acceptable level of lead. So it's been around a long, long time. So what's actually happened in the last 6 months or 9 months, in late 2017, December, they did a new standard for dealing with lead paint. The main changes in the standard was that they've gone from 1% being a lead job to 0.1% being a lead job, and they've added in all the issues around chemical stripping now. So there is a standard for it. Basically, lead paint was lead carbonate. They don't use it anymore, but basically it was sort of phased out in the late 50s, early 60s. Anyone got any idea how much lead was normally put in an exterior paint that went on the outside of houses? It was about 50%. 50% lead went into that particular product. This one was still around in the 90s. When we owned retail paint stores, we were still able to sell it for people that wanted to do boats. But that had 20 to 25%. Red lead was used around windows, doors and things along that line. So it's quite common to come across it. In fact, all housing stock in Australia has lead paint in it. This is an issue that's as big as asbestos. Take no doubt about that. It's a big issue and it needs to be treated. It's not a thing for the weekend warrior to play with. It's as dangerous as asbestos. So how do you get lead poisoning? Basically, it's toxic to humans. You either inhale it or ingest it. How do you ingest it, and why was it such a big issue for kids? They took it out of toys and doors and things along that line, because if anyone's ever tasted lead, it's sweet. It actually has a sweet taste. I had a guy in Rockhampton the other week come up and tell me how, it stunted his growth. All his brothers were 6'4", and he was about 5 foot tall with size 13 feet. So you can imagine, and he said, I can still taste how sweet it was then. So when you look at the chart on the right-hand side, and I'll get this thing going again, no, I'm going to give up. Basically, you can see how it can affect growth, IQ, all of those sort of things. So there's minimal risk when it's in sound condition. Basically, there's no big problem when working with it, because today we're better advised with work health safety. So with work health safety, we're in a situation where we know how to use PPE. So it's not a problem. The public need to be protected by preventing access to the worksite. So you need to barricade the worksite off, and you also need to talk to neighbours and people like that. Deposition of lead waste is another issue, and that's disposing of it properly, but also making sure that people are kept away from the site. There's more complexity. I know we did the Irish Club in Brisbane about 5 years ago. That was a totally different thing to a house that we were doing a few weeks ago, where you can just coordinate the area, lock it off, put covering down, and away you go. So it is a danger area, and you need to be mindful of it. The methods of detection, basically there's 3 key ways you can do that. You can use a portable X-ray machine, you can do a lab analysis, or you can do the identification stick. So this is the type of equipment that they do use to detect lead. There's no requirement to damage any surfaces to do it. I don't think there's one in Queensland. There was one in Sydney. To cart it around, you need special signage on your car because it's radioactive. So it's not something you'd see a lot of. Basically, the next thing that you do see a lot of is laboratory analysis. So that's one of the situations, but as like all sort of things, a laboratory analysis is as good as your collection process.
All buildings built before 1971 in Australia have a high probability of containing lead paint. It's important that you test for lead paint to protect the health of your family and the occupants of the building. Exposure to lead is a health hazard and can cause brain damage in babies, children and adults. It's important that your painter has been trained in correct lead-safe work practices.
You can check the amount of lead in dust and soil by using the methods of sampling and testing outlined in Australian Standard 4361.2 Guide to Lead Paint Management Part 2 Residential and Commercial Buildings. A laboratory test will help determine exactly where lead contaminated dust is located on the building and whether the levels are dangerous. Sampling kits are available from the lead group and include gloves that should be worn to avoid contamination of the sample, test tubes for collecting the sample, and wet wipes to help collect dust. One of the best places to collect lead paint dust samples is on the windowsill of a sash window. As the windows slide up and down during normal use, the friction generates lead paint dust and particles, which can be found on the windowsill. Collect these samples by using the laboratory kit. Using the wipe, collect the dust carefully to avoid contamination and put it in one of the test tubes. Numerous samples should be taken around the building, both inside and outside. Another good place to find dust in a building is to check the vacuum cleaner. It contains a good sample of the dust which can be found in the building. Numerous samples should be taken around the building, both inside and outside. On the exterior, the painter should look for loose paint both on the building and in the soil adjacent to the walls where paint flakes accumulate. He may collect lead paint flakes themselves and dust that is found on the surfaces to be painted. Carefully record the locations where the samples are taken from and clearly mark the locations on each test tube. After the painter has finished painting, he should conduct these tests again at the same locations to ensure that no further contamination has taken place. Collect the dust or soil and send it to a National Association of Testing Authorities registered laboratory for analysis. Ask the laboratory to tell you if lead in the samples is greater than the level in the recommended guidelines. If it is, you'll need to consider your options for safe lead paint work practices or abatement.
I think you can get the idea of how you do that. One of the situations is obviously when you're taking samples outside or anywhere on a lead job. There's a whole lot of procedures of making sure lead doesn't get inside the house, but I can say that particular video story by George Negus I was watching, the painter had ground all of the lead paint off with the windows open, and they had it right across all the bedding, all the pillows, the whole bit. Today what you do is you actually take the samples before you start the job, and you take samples after you take the job, because quite frankly you could end up in some major dramas if you don't prove what you're doing. So basically there's a couple of things you can do, and you've got a few options. Those options are reducing, and the reason being is we've been around dealing with lead for 70 years, so a lot of the options that are available have been already used and exhausted. So the days of just covering it up, you've got to understand some of that lead's now 50, 60, 70 years old now. So you can imagine the substrate's not that good. So you can do nothing, and that's what's been done over the majority of years. You can, carry out abatement, and that's what's happening now, or it's a combination of those sort of things. So doing nothing is really just leave it in sound condition and don't need to be disturbed. Much the same thing as asbestos, really, not any difference. As I said, those options are going. But look, it's really only good if it's not accessible, and it's under layers of paint that are already been overpainted with lead-free paint. So the easiest and cheapest way is, as I said, is to do nothing or overpaint. Basically, it provides an interim and a long-term solution, but those ones have already been used. And when you look at it, you've got materials that can be over the top of it, it's the integrity of the painting, but most of the time you're going to be doing some sort of surface preparation. The option is that you can do replacement, and in that case it may be cheaper and easier to reclad it with new boards. It may be cheaper and easier to use one of the new cladding systems and those types of things and remove it, or a bit of both. You can enclose it. Who remembers in the 80s, all those houses that were peeling, they were overclad with the fake brick, aluminium, plastic weatherboards, all the sort of stuff that they overclad with. All right, well, everyone's tearing those off. If you do overclad, you need to put a sign in there to say, hey, weekend warrior, when you get to this in whatever year you're going to do it in the future, be aware that this is lead paint. The removal or disturbance of lead paint is the greatest potential to generate dust, and you need appropriate containment and ventilation controls and measures and safe work practices. And that's a whole area. Under the MPAQ, we actually do a lead abatement course, which is certified, and we have CSQ funding to assist people who want to do that. So when we look at this type of thing, how do we do it? How can we remove paint? Well, you've got wet scraping and wet sanding. That's a particular house that, and there's a classic example. Someone had a crack at it. The owner spent $7,000 paying someone not to do it properly, then spent another $11,000 to someone to come in and do it properly again. So that's how it works. Wet sanding is not a bucket of water and wet and dry sandpaper. If you're working inside a house, it's a spray bottle. You don't want to contaminate the water and keep putting your hands in there. On-site chemical stripping, that's what's happening there. Off-site chemical stripping you can do. Remove by heat gun and scraper, big no-no. As you saw, you can inhale the fumes of lead. You don't want to be doing that. So that's a big no-no, leave that alone. Mechanical sanding is probably the most common way that paint's dealt with, and lead paint's still no different. If you're going to mechanically sanding, you need to enclose the surface or use HEPA filter systems on vacuum-assisted type equipment. So on-site chemical stripping, basically they spray the stripper on, it works like a poultice. It can take up to 20 odd layers or more off in one go. That's becoming the most popular way of doing it because you get no damage to the surface, and it's the safest way to remove lead paint. You can take things along and put them into baths, but really this applies to doors, windows, things that are simply removed. You're not going to be able to drop a whole house into a bath like that. If you've ever dealt with stripped doors before, it can also take the glues out of all the joints and those types of things and give you other additional problems. So paint removal, as you can see by here, you've got someone using a HEPA filter system with a sander. They're still covered with PPE because, when that sander goes down over the edges, it's not going to suck up the dust, is it? So it's going to flick it around. So you can see what happens. A HEPA filter is in specialist equipment. You're not going to get it in your $79 machine that comes out of Bunnings at a wet and dry. That particular machine's worth about $1,300, and that's got a Rotex sander on it from Festool. So containment's another area that you need to be really, really conscious, and that is that you need to make sure you prevent dust and waste from going everywhere, and there's a number of ways of doing that. So it's not something you just simply rock along the weekend warrior or the builder that says, oh, okay, let's get the grinder out and grind this stuff off. No, you need to test it, and if it's pre-1971, you're more than likely dealing with lead unless it's been stripped before.